This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we open a file that history tried to hide. The story begins with a photograph. A small sepia print, barely larger than a man's hand, discovered in 2014 in a private collection in Richmond, Virginia. The paper was cracked, its corners curled with age. Two men stood side by side, both dressed formally, both looking directly at the camera. At first glance, it was an ordinary 19th century studio portrait, but there was something unsettling in its stillness. The man on the left, white, mid-20s, neatly pressed suit, stood with a confident but restrained posture. The man on the right, black, about the same age, eyes thoughtful, hands clasped in front of him, wore a coat too large for his frame. His shoes were worn, his shoulders tense, as though the act of standing beside his friend was both defiance and danger. In the lower corner of the photograph, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, someone had written two names in faded ink. T. Whitmore M. Freeman, 1889. No further information was included. For years, it sat forgotten in a box of unrelated documents until a historian named Elena Carroll stumbled upon it while cataloging estate donations. The image struck her immediately, not because of what it showed, but because of what it dared to show. In 1889, Virginia was still a place divided by race and memory. The Civil War had ended only 24 years earlier, but its shadow had not lifted. Segregation laws, debt peonage, and enforced silence kept millions of Black Americans in conditions barely different from slavery. The idea of a black man and a white man photographed together as equals was more than rare. It was almost unthinkable. Dr. Carroll cleaned the image under low light, breathing life back into the silver surface. Beneath the dust and time, the men's expressions became clearer. They weren't smiling not because of stiffness or convention, but because the camera had caught something weightier, the awareness that their simple act of standing together would not be forgiven. Curiosity turned to obsession. Carroll began tracing every clue she could. Old census records, church registers, local directories. The Whitmore name led her to a family of minor prominence merchants who had operated a tobacco warehouse on the James River. But Marcus Freeman's name was harder to find. It appeared once in a labor roll from 1887, listed under Freeman M. Porter Whitmore Storage Company. That was the connection. Employer and employee, or at least that's how it began. Further searching revealed court records from 1890 showing that the Whitmore Company had been fined for illegal labor retention, a polite phrase for something closer to bondage. The system was known as debt peonage, a shadow form of slavery that persisted long after abolition. Workers, often black men unable to pay arbitrary debts or fines, were forced to labor for years under contracts they could not break. The Whitmores were not alone in this. It was common throughout the South. But the photograph suggested something that no record did: a personal bond that crossed that line. Carroll's notes from that night simply read, "If they were friends, they risked everything." When she examined the photograph under magnification, she found something faintly etched on the wooden backdrop of the studio, a mark like the impression of a chain, looping across the wall. Not painted, but pressed in, as though the prop itself had once been used for something else. The more she looked, the more it felt like the photograph was speaking not with words, but with symbols buried in the grain of its surface. Who were Thomas Whitmore and Marcus Freeman? Why did they stand together, risking ruin in a time when even proximity could provoke violence? Carroll's next discovery came not from archives, but from the margins of a letter written decades later, found in an attic trunk belonging to the Whitmore family's descendants. It read, "He was my brother, though we shared no blood. I did what I could, but I was too late. The photograph was our promise." Signed simply, T.W. That letter changed everything. The Whitmore docks along the James River were not places for sentiment. The air was thick with the smell of cured tobacco, sweat, and coal dust. Men shouted over crates and barrels. Stevedores moved in endless rhythm between the water and the warehouse. In that world, nobody was seen as more than their use. It was there that Thomas Whitmore and Marcus Freeman first met. Thomas was the youngest son of Edward Whitmore, owner of the company that bore their name. Educated in London for several years, he had returned home reluctantly after his father's illness. His brothers ran the business with a stern efficiency that treated men like inventory. Thomas, by contrast, walked through the warehouse like a visitor in a foreign land, polite, detached, uneasy with the cruelty that passed for order. Marcus had worked there for 3 years. He was quiet, tall, with a manner that made men underestimate him. He could read and write, a dangerous skill for a black laborer in Virginia at the time, and he used it carefully, keeping small notes in a pocket ledger no one else saw. They met during a summer storm. Lightning cracked over the river, and the warehouse roof leaked in long, vertical lines. Thomas had been inspecting ledgers when he saw Marcus climbing the rafters to patch a hole. The young man slipped. Thomas instinctively grabbed a rope and steadied him. For a brief moment, they were face to face, two men from opposite worlds, both aware of what that moment might look like to anyone watching. Later, when the storm passed, Thomas found Marcus behind the warehouse, reading by lamplight. The book was a collection of sermons by Frederick Douglass, forbidden material in many parts of Virginia. Thomas said nothing. He simply sat down beside him and asked, quietly, "How do you read by such dim light?" Marcus didn't look up. "I read fast," he said. That was the beginning. Over the following months, they spoke in fragments: weather, shipments, the new machines arriving from the north. Gradually, their conversations deepened. Marcus told him about his father, who had been born enslaved and freed in 1865, only to die 10 years later in debt to the same plantation that had owned him. Thomas told him about London, about streets where no one cared who your father was, only what your voice sounded like. They met often after work, sitting near the water where the city lights shimmered in the current. To anyone passing, they were just two silhouettes, one standing, one seated, both silent. But what grew between them was more than curiosity. It was recognition. Thomas began bringing him books, old volumes discarded from his family's library. Marcus devoured them. In return, he taught Thomas the quiet language of the docks, how to sense the moods of the men, how to listen for danger before it arrived. Then, in the winter of 1888, everything changed. A worker named Samuel Orr was caught trying to leave the docks with unpaid debts. The foreman beat him nearly to death and locked him in the warehouse overnight. Marcus witnessed it but said nothing until Thomas found out. He confronted his brother, Henry Whitmore, demanding Orr's release. Henry laughed. "The debt is the law," he said. "He owes, he stays. You think freedom comes with ink and paper?" Thomas left without another word. That night, Marcus slipped Orr out of the warehouse and put him on a freight train heading north. The escape was discovered by morning. Rumors spread fast, and suspicion fell on everyone. Thomas took the blame before Marcus could be questioned. He told his family he had paid the man's debt himself, and arranged his departure. His father disowned him within a week. The friendship that had begun in quiet understanding was now sealed by shared danger. For months afterward, Thomas lived apart from his family, working in a small law office downtown. Marcus continued on the docks, now watched more closely, his every movement noted. They saw each other rarely, and only at night. It was during one of those meetings that the idea of the photograph emerged. Thomas had said, "If they erase us, let them find proof." Marcus had replied, "A picture won't save us." But Thomas insisted, "Maybe not, but it will say we stood in the same light." They went to a small studio near Broad Street, run by a German photographer named Herr Lenz, who asked no questions. It was early spring of 1889. The air outside smelled of river and smoke. They stood side by side, facing the Lenz one man born free, one born into a system that refused to admit it was dead. Lenz exposed the plate, the flash blooming like a silent confession. Neither of them could have known that it would be the last time they were seen together. 2 weeks later, Marcus disappeared. The docks whispered of an arrest, a debt, a name turned over in exchange for silence. No records survived. The Whitmore family buried the scandal, and Thomas left Richmond entirely. Years passed. The photograph remained, hidden among his papers, never displayed. He married, moved north, raised children who never knew the name Marcus Freeman. Only in one letter, written near the end of his life, did he mention it again. He wrote, "If ever they ask what I believed, tell them I once knew a man who stood beside me when the world said we could not." The photograph remained lost for more than a century. When Thomas Whitmore died in 1926, his family packed his belongings into trunks and placed them in a carriage house behind their Virginia estate. Decades of dust settled over them. Time, as it often does, became a curtain, soft and silent. No one spoke of the docks or the name Marcus Freeman. In 2014, when the property was finally sold, the new owner allowed local historians to examine the surviving documents. Among them was a small wooden chest wrapped in yellowed linen. Inside lay fragments of correspondence, faded ledgers, and a single photograph protected by a cracked glass frame. It was that photograph. The historian who found it, Dr. Elena Carroll, realized immediately that she was looking at something rare, but she didn't yet understand how rare. She described the moment in her notes. "Two men, standing equal. The picture is quiet, but I feel a noise beneath it." She sent the image to a photography lab for restoration. Under magnification, small details began to emerge that the human eye could not have caught in 1889. The faint mark behind Marcus, the outline of a shackle embedded in the wall, a paper pinned to the backdrop that seemed to read, barely legible, Contract 47. Carol's first thought was that it was a studio number, but when she cross-referenced the handwriting, it matched an entry in the Virginia Bureau of Labor's archive from the same year. Contract 47 was the classification for labor custodianship, a euphemism for debt servitude. Marcus Freeman had been one of them. In early 1889, he had been charged with breach of contract, the same legal trick used to trap freedmen into endless labor. A fine was imposed, and the only way to pay it off was to work for the Whitmore Company. The law called it employment. In truth, it was slavery, by another name. Dr. Carroll followed the trail of court records and found something even stranger. The fine was cleared abruptly, without payment, only a few weeks after the date the photograph was taken. The signature on the release form was T. Whitmore. Thomas had not only freed him, he had done so illegally. It explained the risk, the tension in their faces, the way the photograph felt less like vanity and more like a document, a witness statement pressed into silver. But the deeper Carol went, the darker the story became. In the spring of 1889, 2 weeks after the photograph was taken, Marcus Freeman vanished. The Richmond Police Archives recorded an incident on the river, a body found but never identified. No burial record, no family claim. The description fit him exactly. The coroner's notes read, "Male, colored, approximately 30 years. Cause of death uncertain. No visible wounds. Found near the docks at low tide." The body was buried in a municipal lot with no name. Thomas left Richmond shortly after. He never returned. What Carol couldn't explain was how the photograph ended up in his possession after Marcus disappeared. She theorized that Marcus himself may have given it to him the day they posed for it, an act of trust or farewell. When she scanned the back of the image, she found faint handwriting, nearly invisible except under angled light. The message, written in pencil, read, "They can take the work, not the memory." It was signed with 2 initials, MF. The discovery made headlines in academic circles, though most people never heard of it. Carol tried to publish her findings, but the Whitmore descendants requested anonymity, claiming privacy concerns. The story slipped quietly through the cracks of public history, just another footnote in the long, unspoken ledger of injustice. Years later, one of Carol's students, David Reyes, found her research unfinished in a locked drawer after her death. Her final note was dated 6 months before she passed away. "I've seen the original again. There's something new on the glass, an imprint of a fingerprint that wasn't there before." The lab confirmed it. The fingerprint was fresh. No one knew how. By the time the story reached the modern day, the photograph had passed through a century of silence. Generations had lived and died without knowing the names written faintly beneath it. But in 2018, a young historian named Clara Whitmore, a direct descendant of Thomas, discovered Dr. Carroll's research by accident. She wasn't looking for scandal or ghosts. She was preparing a family archive for donation when she found a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever still asks why." Inside was a copy of the 1889 photograph, and one line written in a trembling hand. "We stood together once. That's all that mattered." The handwriting matched Thomas's known letters. Clara had grown up believing her family's history was respectable. Landowners, lawyers, business people. But as she read through Carol's files, she realized every generation had kept the same quiet omission. The docks, the contracts, the debts, and Marcus Freeman. Her great-great-grandfather's journals mentioned him only once. "Marcus will not leave the river. He says it holds what was taken." The meaning was unclear, but something about it lingered. Driven by curiosity, Clara retraced Carol's steps. She visited the riverfront where the old Whitmore warehouse once stood. Only a few bricks remained, overgrown with moss. The James River slid past in its steady, indifferent way, carrying the same current that had swallowed Marcus's story more than a century before. When she took out her phone to photograph the ruins, something peculiar happened. The image refused to focus. The screen blurred, as if the lens were fogged. She wiped it again and tried once more. The second photo came out clear, until she looked closely. In the reflection on the water, 2 shapes stood side by side. One wore a dark coat, the other a lighter one. Neither figure was hers. She checked the spot again. Empty. Only the river, the wind, and the faint echo of the freight line running somewhere beyond the trees. That night, Clara reviewed the photo on her computer. The reflection was still there. Two men, facing forward, the same distance apart as in the 1889 portrait. The metadata showed a strange timestamp. March 3rd, 1889, not 2018. At first, she thought it was a glitch, a digital corruption, a coincidence of pattern and shadow. But when she compared it to the original photograph, the alignment was exact. Even the tilt of Marcus's head matched perfectly. She sent the file to a colleague specializing in photographic anomalies. He ran it through several authenticity tests, each one confirming that the reflection was real, light and geometry consistent with the environment, impossible to fake without digital manipulation. There was no manipulation. A few weeks later, Clara received an unmarked envelope at her office. Inside was a single item, a glass negative, nearly identical to the original Whitmore plate, except this one contained something new. Where the 1889 image had shown a painted studio backdrop, this version showed open sky. And behind the two men stood a faint outline of the river, rippling across time. She stored it in a temperature-controlled cabinet, logging every detail. But one line from Dr. Carroll's research wouldn't leave her mind. The fingerprint appeared after 125 years. Maybe the image isn't finished. On a quiet evening, Clara held the negative up to the light. In the lower corner, barely visible, a thumbprint shimmered against the glass. Her instinct told her not to touch it, but she did. The glass felt warm. And when she set it down, the condensation of her breath left two impressions on the surface, hers and another, slightly larger, just beside it. In the reflection of that glass, she thought she saw movement. The faint suggestion of two men turning toward her, not hostile, but waiting. The next morning, the negative was gone. Her security cameras showed nothing. The case had never been opened. But on her desk, where the glass had been, was a note written in the same faded script as Thomas Whitmore's letters. You kept your promise. Some stories refuse to end. They circle through time like a voice caught in an empty hall, whispering, fading, and returning again when someone dares to listen. The photograph of Thomas Whitmore and Marcus Freeman was never meant to be found twice, yet it kept resurfacing. Every discovery carried it forward a little more, pulling their faces from the shadows inch by inch, until their silence became louder than the history that tried to erase them. Clara Whitmore spent months searching for the missing negative. She combed through every archive, every auction house, every local record that might have absorbed her family's name, but she found nothing. Then, one morning, an email arrived from an anonymous account. No subject, no signature, just a single link. Against her better judgment, she clicked it. A website opened, minimalist, black background, white text, freemanwhitmorearchive.org. There was only one file available for download, an image titled contract_47_fullrestoration.jpg. The loading bar crawled forward. When the image appeared, she froze. It was the photograph, but not the one she knew. This version was impossibly clear, as though someone had rephotographed the original through a century's worth of memory. The two men stood in perfect focus. Thomas's face, soft but defiant. Marcus's calm, proud, with a quiet endurance in his eyes. Behind them, the faint outline of the warehouse dissolved into open water. And in that water, if you looked closely, you could see the reflection of a woman standing in the present, holding a phone. It was her. She closed the laptop immediately, her pulse hammering. The photo shouldn't have known her face, her posture, the way she had stood by the river months before. Yet there she was, caught like a reflection that had existed before the moment itself. When she reopened the file later, the reflection was gone. Only the two men remained, their expressions softer somehow, as though satisfied that they had been seen. That night, she wrote a letter to the Virginia Historical Society. It began as an archival report and ended as a confession. If memory can survive through glass, then maybe forgiveness can too. I believe they wanted to be remembered, not pitied. One man broke the law to give another a life, and the world buried them both for it. Let this be their freedom. She submitted everything, Carol's notes, the digital scan, the letters, and the physical photograph, under a simple request: make it public. The society accepted. They launched an exhibit titled The Freeman Whitmore Photograph, A Friendship Against Time. The opening night drew only a modest crowd, a handful of scholars, local residents, and two descendants of Marcus Freeman's family who had never heard their ancestors' names spoken aloud in such light. Then, when the lights dimmed, the curator explained the story. She spoke of the docks, the hidden contract, the risks they took, and the image that proved their existence. And for a moment, as she described the final scan, the projector flickered, just once, and a faint ripple passed across the image on the screen. Most people didn't notice, but Clara did. She leaned forward, certain she saw the reflection of movement within the photograph. Not an illusion, not light distortion, something subtler. The two men had shifted slightly closer together. After the exhibit, she stayed behind. The hall emptied, the lights lowered, and the sound of rain began to patter softly against the windows. She stood before the display case holding the restored print. The glass surface caught her reflection and split it, one half her, one half the world behind her. That. Then, in the mirrored half, something changed. The faint outline of Thomas Whitmore seemed to turn, just enough that his eyes aligned with hers. Marcus's hand, once clasped before him, now appeared open, as if in a gesture of peace. Clara didn't move. She simply whispered, "We found you." The lights flickered once more, and the reflection faded back into stillness. When the night guard made his rounds hours later, he noted a small change in the exhibit's logbook. The temperature had dropped 2 degrees near the photograph, though the climate controls showed no malfunction. He also wrote one final line in his report. For a moment, I thought I saw a second reflection in the glass. 2 men standing behind the visitor's image. Not. The incident was never explained. Over time, the story of the photograph spread quietly. Articles appeared in academic journals, art forums, local news outlets. Each retelling brought the same fascination: how an image from 1889 could carry so much unspoken humanity, how it could survive so many attempts to disappear. People began leaving flowers at the site where the Whitmore warehouse once stood. A simple plaque now marks the spot. Here, 2 men stood equal when the world refused to see them that way. The river still moves past, dark and unhurried, the same current that once carried away the evidence of Marcus Freeman's life, now carrying the echo of his name. And sometimes, when the fog drifts low and the air hangs still, locals swear they see two silhouettes on the water's edge, one taller, one leaner, standing side by side, looking out towards the current. No one who has seen them feels fear. Only the strange comfort that some promises, once made, are never truly broken. Perhaps the photograph was never haunted at all. Perhaps it was just unfinished. Because history, like silver film, develops slowly, layer by layer, touch by touch, until the truth finally reveals itself. This is Deep Night Whispers. The night remembers those the world tried to forget. And somewhere, on the river's edge, the light still holds them both,